You wake before first light in the small stone cottage on the edge of the Somerset Levels, and the February darkness presses close against the single window, heavy with mist that has crept up from the flooded Rhines. The sound that draws you out of sleep is the steady rain on the thatch, a soft, hissing whisper that has not stopped since you went to bed and will not stop for days, weeks perhaps, until the land itself forgets what it means to be dry. You lie still under a thick blanket and a woolen coverlet that have been warmed by your own body through the night, feeling the cool damp air on your face while the rest of you stays encased in that small pocket of heat. The room around you is simple and bare, a low wooden bed with a thin straw mattress, a single stool set near the hearth, a rushlight in a crude iron holder that you let burn down to a stub the night before, a hook on the wall where your coat and smock hang, already waiting for the day. There is no clock, no bell, no call from outside, only the deep internal knowing, learned over many years, that it is time to rise, the hour when the world still belongs to the night, but the work must begin. You push the covers back slowly, letting the cold slide in, and sit up on the edge of the bed, feeling the rough stone floor through the thin soles of your bare feet. The chill rises through your legs and settles in your joints, a familiar ache that belongs to February, to wet ground and damp air, and you greet it without complaint, as you would an old neighbor. For a moment you just sit, breathing, listening to the rain's endless variation, now a scattered pattering, now a heavier drumming, as a gust of wind shakes the eaves, then a return to the softer, more constant note. The cottage is dark, but not absolute, for the faintest smear of grey is beginning to seep through the oiled cloth that covers the window, so that you can just make out the shapes of things, the stool, the hearth, the low ceiling beam, blackened with years of peat smoke. You reach for the woolen hose that you left bunched at the foot of the bed and pull them on over feet that are calloused and thick-skinned from walking the drove roads, feeling the familiar scratch of the knit against your shins. Next come the breeches of coarse wool, loose enough to allow the bending and stooping the work will require, fastened at the waist with a simple leather thong. Over your linen shirt you draw a heavy smock that falls to your thighs, its fabric stained with mud and weathered to a soft grey-brown. Then over that, a coat that has been patched at the elbows with newer cloth, its colour a darker shade against the old. You do not hurry. Each movement is slow and deliberate, a ritual performed in the same order as every other morning, your fingers finding the toggles and ties in the half-dark without needing to look. The last layer is a woolen scarf wound once around the neck and a felt hat, broad-brimmed, that you take from its peg by the door. Now you cross the small space to the hearth, where the fire has died down to a heap of grey ash, with a few embers still glowing deep inside. Orange hearts pulsing faintly as though the cottage itself were breathing in its sleep. You kneel, not on the bare stone, but on a woven rush mat, placed there for that purpose, and with a small iron poker you gently stir the ashes, bringing the live embers together, coaxing them into a little mound of heat. A handful of dry straw from a basket near the chimney goes onto the embers first, and you blow softly, steadily, until a small flame catches, yellow and thin, licking at the straw's edge. You feed it with twigs of willow that snap with a sound of small bones breaking, then a split log of alder that catches more slowly, smoking at first before the flame wraps around it. The fire is soon a modest, well-behaved thing, just enough to warm the pot and take the keenest edge off the damp air, never roaring or wasteful. Your breakfast is as simple as the room, as the morning, as the life you live here on the Levels. From a covered crock on the floor you take a portion of yesterday's oat porridge, stiff and cold, and scrape it into a small iron pot with a splash of water from the bucket by the door. The pot goes onto a trivet over the young flames, and while it warms you stand at the table, a board of scrubbed elm that has been smoothed by the passage of countless bowls and elbows, and you pour yourself a cup of small beer from a stoneware jug. The beer is thin and faintly sour, brewed not for pleasure, but for safe drinking, and you take a long swallow that clears the dryness of sleep from your throat. The porridge heats slowly, releasing a soft, earthy smell that mingles with the peat smoke and the damp wool of your coat, and when it is warm enough to eat, you take the pot directly in your hand, sitting on the stool near the fire, spooning the thick paste into your mouth without hurry, chewing each mouthful until it is thoroughly softened. The rain outside has not slackened, but its voice changes as you sit there, and you can tell without opening the door that the wind has shifted slightly, that the droplets are now driving against the north wall of the cottage rather than falling straight down. This is information that matters to you because the wind direction will affect how wet you become on the drove, how the withies will feel in your hands later, how the groundwater will lie in the osier bed. But you do not dwell on it in any anxious way. You simply note it as you note the sputter of the rushlight when a drip of fat rolls into the flame, as you note the slow brightening of the grey square that is the window, shifting from charcoal to a paler slate. When the porridge is finished and the pot scraped clean with a wooden spoon, you carry it to the bucket, rinse it with a little water, and set it upside down on the table to drain. The beer cup follows. Every action is part of a quiet order that leaves the cottage as it was, ready for the evening return. You do not speak, there is no one to speak to, and the silence is not lonely, but rather full of small sounds. The fires crackle, the creak of the stool as you rise, the distant call of a moorhen from somewhere out in the flooded fields. A sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, muffled by fog. Now you turn to the tools. They hang on their own hooks by the door, a billhook with a curved blade that you sharpened 2 days ago and tested on a dry stick until it bit cleanly, a length of hempen cord coiled in a tight loop, a leather palm guard, dark with use, shaped to fit the curve of your right hand and protect it from blisters and splinters, and a woven willow basket, flat and wide, that you use for carrying small scraps, for gathering kindling, for any number of small tasks. For gathering kindling, you check the billhook's edge with a careful thumb, find it still sharp enough to catch the light, and slide it into a leather sheath that hangs from your belt. The cord goes into a deep pocket of your coat, coiled so that it will not tangle. The palm guard you slip onto your hand now, tightening the thong so that it is ready. The basket you pick up last, its handle worn smooth, its woven sides showing the darker traces of older mud, older seasons. You are nearly ready, but there is one more small ritual. By the door, on a narrow shelf, sits a clay lamp that you fill with a little oil, its wick bent to one side, and a tinderbox you will not need today because the fire is alive. But beside these things is a round loaf of bread, wrapped in a linen cloth, and a wedge of hard cheese, and a small brown onion. These you place into the basket, tucking the cloth around them, for you will not return to the cottage until the light fails. The basket's contents settle with a quiet rustle, and the weight of the food is a comfort, a small promise of the rest that will come at midday. At last you lift the iron latch, a simple bar that falls into a notch, and you pull the heavy wooden door inward. The cold air that rushes in is thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation, a deep, ancient scent that belongs to the levels, to the peat and the water and the slow decay of winter. You step outside onto the stone threshold, and the rain greets you gently, not in a hard downpour but a fine, persistent drizzle that instantly begins to bead on the shoulders of your wool coat. You pause for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the near darkness, for although the morning is beginning, the cloud is so low and heavy that it might as well still be night. A dim grey world without shadows, without edges, where the lane just beyond the cottage is only a suggestion of lighter ground between darker ditches. The cottage sits at the end of a short path that meets the drove road, a raised track that runs arrow straight across the levels, built up over centuries with stone and gravel, so that it stays passable even in the wettest months. On either side of the drove, the rines stretch away into the fog, their water surfaces barely distinguishable from the air above, except when a ripple catches what little light there is. A brief silver line that vanishes as soon as it appears. The pollard willows that line the drove at intervals are black skeletons against the grey, their knotted heads bristling with last year's rods, waiting for the cutter's return. The fields beyond them are sheets of shallow water, the winter floods that have not drained and will not drain until March, and across those waters the mist moves in slow drifts, like a living thing breathing close to the ground. You step off the threshold and onto the path, the mud sucking softly at your boots, and you walk the few steps to the drove where the ground is firmer, packed by hooves and feet, the gravel making a crunching sound that is the loudest thing in the world right now. You turn left on the drove, heading east towards the river and the osier bed, and your figure, if anyone were watching, would be just another shape in the fog, a dark patch moving slowly through a darker landscape, the broad brim of your hat shedding a steady drip of water onto the shoulders of your coat. The lane is familiar to you in every detail, known as well as the walls of your own cottage, known by the feel of it through your boots as much as by sight. You pass the leaning gate that marks the start of Dyer's Field. Its post rotted at the base so that it hangs at an angle but never quite falls, held by generations of wire and string and habit. You pass the crossing plank, a single oak board laid over a narrow rhine, slippery with algae even in the dry months, treacherously smooth now under a film of rain. You step across it without thinking, your body knowing exactly where to place each foot, and you continue on. The hedgerows on your left are a tangle of bare hawthorn and blackthorn, their branches interlaced, their thorns sharp and grey, and in them small birds are beginning to stir, a rustle of wings, a single high note that cuts through the rain sound and then stops. The light continues to lift as you walk, but so slowly that you do not notice it happening, only that after a time the world has moved from black to a uniform grey, and you can now see the individual droplets that cling to every twig, every blade of last year's sedge, every stone in the road, each one a tiny lens holding a distorted image of the sky. Your breath comes out in visible puffs that merge with the mist, and you feel the cold on the tip of your nose and the edges of your ears. But the rest of you is warm from the walking, from the layers of wool, from the slow burning of the porridge in your stomach. You shift the basket from one hand to the other, feeling the familiar weight of the billhook at your belt, the cord in your pocket, the palm guard already in place, and everything is as it should be. Nothing missing, nothing to fret over. Ahead, the drove dips slightly, and you can just make out the shape of a half-submerged alder tree that grows at the junction where you will turn off towards the river. Its lower trunk is always in water, and it has learned to live that way, sending out roots that breathe at the surface like knuckles, and its upper branches are hung with last year's catkins, dark little cones that swing in the drizzle. You reach the alder and turn right onto a narrower track, one that only you and maybe two other cutters use, a path that is more mud than stone, and your boots begin to sink a little deeper with each step, a slow, rhythmic pull and release that you feel in the muscles of your thighs. The osier bed is still a quarter-mile ahead, hidden by a screen of sedge and low willows, but you can smell it now, that distinctive scent of willow bark that is at once bitter and clean, a greener smell than the general wet rot of the levels, carrying on the damp air like a signature. The rain has eased to a fine mist now, and the world is utterly still, the water in the Rhine's glass smooth, reflecting the grey sky so perfectly that the land and the heavens seem to be the same substance, separated only by the narrowest line of black earth that is the path you walk upon. You do not hurry. Your pace is a steady plod, the pace that will carry you through a full day of cutting without tiring you too quickly, and as you walk, you allow your thoughts to grow small and quiet, no longer worrying over plans or lists, just the pure observation of the moment. The drip of water from the tip of a sedge blade, the bubble that rises from the mud and pops silently, the soft scurrying of a water vole that you do not see but know is there time makes, a swift rustle and then silence. The track bends, and there it is, the osier bed, a low-lying field of willow stools that stretches away into the fog, row upon row of bare rods standing in the shallow flood water, their colours muted to browns and reds and pale golds by the grey light. You stop for a moment at the edge, looking out over the bed, and a feeling that is not quite excitement, but something close to satisfaction, settles deep in your chest. The withies are straight and tall, a good crop, and the day stretches ahead of you, long and quiet and full of simple work, and nothing else in the world matters. You step over the last clump of sedge, adjust the palm guard one more time, and walk into the water among the willows, where the real day begins. The path from your cottage door meets the drove road at a muddy junction marked by a single flat stone, and here you pause for a moment, adjusting the coil of hempen cord in your coat pocket, feeling the weight of the billhook against your thigh, and listening to the rain which has slackened now to a fine misty drizzle that hangs in the air more than it falls. The drove stretches away east and west, a raised causeway built up over centuries with packed gravel, broken stone, and the constant tread of feet and hooves, its surface dark with moisture and faintly gleaming where puddles have formed in the cart ruts. On either side, the Rhines run parallel to the road, their water the color of tarnished pewter, so still that they could be strips of silk laid flat across the land, except where the occasional drip from an overhanging branch sends a ring spreading outward in slow, perfect circles. This is the hour when the night is just beginning to loosen its hold, and the world appears not in colors, but in degrees of grey. From the near black of the water at the Rhine's far edge, to the paler grey of the cloud that sits so low it seems to rest on the tops of the distant pollard willows. You turn east, as you always do, and begin the walk that will carry you along the drove for a full mile before the turn-off to the osier bed, and you settle into a pace that is neither slow nor hurried, a walking rhythm that your body knows as well as breathing, each footfall landing with a soft crunch of gravel that is swallowed quickly by the damp air. The boots you wear are thick-soled and greased with tallow, and they make a gentle squelching sound when you step through the thinner patches of mud that lie between the stones, a sound that blends with the endless dripping of water from every leaf, every twig, every blade of last year's sedge that leans over the road's edge. Your felt hat brim catches the drizzle and channels it into two steady drips that fall from the front corners, landing on the shoulders of your coat with a pattering so regular it becomes a kind of quiet music, and your breath rises in slow clouds that drift behind you and dissolve into the general mist. The drove road is bordered on the left by a low hedge of hawthorn and blackthorn that has been laid and pleached many years ago. Its branch is now a tangle of bare grey stems studded with sharp thorns, and here the small birds of the levels are beginning to stir, their movements hidden from sight but audible as a faint rustle, a soft chirring, the occasional single note that rings out high and thin and stops as suddenly as it began. A wren hops from twig to twig just inside the hedge, and though you cannot see it, you know its small brown body and copped tail by the pattern of its movements, the quick flit and pause that is as familiar to you as the shape of your own hand. To your right, the Rhine widens into a shallow mere, a flooded corner of a field that in summer would be pasture, but now is a sheet of grey water popped by the slow rain, and on it a pair of moorhens drift with a motion that seems effortless, their dark bodies leaving a V-shaped wake that spreads and fades. Their calls come across the water, the sharp sudden note that carries in the damp air, and then silence again. You pass the leaning gate that marks the boundary of Dyer's Field, a gate that has been leaning for as long as you can remember, its top hinge broken and its post rotted at the base, so that the whole structure hangs at an angle, yet somehow it still serves, the bottom bar still catching in its socket when someone bothers to close it, which is rarely. The wood of the gate is silvered with age and wet with rain, and droplets cling to its underside, swelling until they grow heavy enough to fall, each one a brief, bright bead against the grey. Your hand reaches out as you pass and touches the top rail, a habit you have never questioned, and the wood is smooth and cold and slick, and the touch leaves your fingers wetter than before, so you wipe them absently on the thigh of your breeches and keep walking. The light is changing now, not quickly, but in a steady, incremental way that you sense rather than observe, the way a tide rises without any single wave making a difference. The sky, which before was a uniform charcoal, has separated into layers of lighter and darker cloud, and far to the east there is a pale band just above the horizon that might be the promise of a morning sun, or might simply be a thinning of the cloud, a momentary gap that will close again in a few minutes. This small brightness, however faint, is enough to bring the landscape into sharper focus, and now you can see the individual sedge clumps that dot the flooded fields, each one a little island of coarse brown blades with a skirt of water at its base, and you can see the distant line of willows that marks the river's course, their bare upper branches etched against the grey in fine dark lines. The crossing plank comes into view ahead, a single length of oak that spans a narrow Rhine where the road dips, and here the water is deeper and darker, the colour of strong tea, with a slow current that pulls the surface weeds into trailing shapes. The plank is set on two low stone abutments, and its surface has been worn smooth by countless crossings over the years, polished to a dull sheen that is now made treacherous by a film of wet algae. You step onto it without hesitation because your feet know exactly where the edges are, and the plank flexes slightly under your weight, a gentle bounce that you absorb in your knees as you cross, the water just inches below the soles of your boots. Midway you pause for a heartbeat, looking down at your own reflection, a dark shape that wavers and breaks apart as a breeze ruffles the surface, and then you step off onto the far bank, the gravel of the drove crunching under your heel, and the plank is behind you, already forgotten. On the far side of the crossing, the character of the drove changes. The hedge on the left gives way to open ground, a wide expanse of rush and reed that stretches away towards the distant Polden Ridge, which on a clear day would be visible as a low blue line, but today is nothing but a darker smudge of cloud on cloud. The wind, which had been still, now moves just enough to be felt, a slow cold drift that comes from the west and brings with it the smell of the peat moors, a sweet dark scent of ancient decay, of vegetation that has been rotting for 1,000 years in the waterlogged earth. The sound of your boots changes too, because here the drove is less well maintained, the gravel thinner, the mud softer, so that each step sinks a little and pulls free with a soft sucking noise that is the dominant sound of the walk now, a steady plock and release that sets a rhythm for your breathing. You pass a clump of alder trees that grow at the edge of a feeder rhine, their trunks dark and wet, their bark fissured into deep patterns that trap the damp and hold it, and from their lower branches hang last summer's cones, tiny dark knobs that rattle faintly when the breeze stirs them. One of the trees has a branch that overhangs the road, and as you pass under it, a shower of accumulated droplets fall onto your hat and shoulders, a sudden cold pattering that makes you blink and shake your head, a small annoyance that is gone before it registers, leaving only the feeling of water trickling down the back of your neck. A slow, cool line that you do not bother to wipe away. The drove bends slightly to the left here, following the contour of an old silted-up mere, and around the bend you come upon the half-submerged alder that marks the turn-off to the osier bed, the same tree that you have passed every working day of every winter for more years than you can count. The trunk rises from a pool of permanent standing water so dark it reflects nothing, and the lower portion of the bark is stained a greenish black where the water laps at it, while the upper branches are clean and grey and bear a scattering of catkins that hang like tiny ornaments. The tree is alive, though it looks half dead, and it has adapted to its flooded life by sending up small breathing roots that break the surface of the water like a circle of knobby knees, and these are coated with a thin layer of bright green algae that catches what little light there is. At the alder, you stop for a moment and look back along the drove the way you have come, though there is nothing to look at but the grey road stretching into grey mist, the single line of your own footprint softened at the edges by the rain. Ahead, the narrow track that leads to the osier bed branches off to the right, a faint line of churned mud between walls of high sedge, and you can already see the tops of the first willow stools beyond, their bare rods rising in a dense thicket that blurs at the edges where the mist has not yet lifted. This track is yours. You know it by the feel of its mud on your boots, by the particular way the sedge catches at your coat, by the soft squelch that deepens as you leave the raised drove and step down onto the lower ground where the water table sits just below the surface. The track to the osier bed is short, no more than 200 paces, but it is the slowest part of the walk because the mud here is deep and treacherous, and each step requires a small effort of balance. Your boots sink to the ankles, and the mud makes a sound like a deep sigh each time you pull free, a long, slow release of suction that is at once unpleasant and entirely familiar. The sedge on either side is tall enough to brush your shoulders, and its blades are sharp-edged and wet, so that with each passing you collect a new layer of water on your coat, which by now is soaked through on the outside while still warm and dry on the inside, a testament to the thick wool and the slow pace of the walk. Small insects, stirred by your passage, rise from the mud and hang in the air for a moment before settling again, and a frog leaps from a puddle with a soft plop, leaving a ring that widens and fades. The soundscape has changed again, because here, close to the osier bed and away from the open rhines, the world is quieter, the rain muffled by the dense stand of sedge, the wind reduced to a faint sighing in the tops of the willows ahead. The only clear sounds are the calls of lapwings somewhere high above the mist, their cry a thin, trembling note that seems to come from the sky itself, and the steady drip of water from the sedge blades, each drop landing with a tiny metallic tick when it hits a puddle or a patch of standing water. Your breathing is the loudest thing, a soft, regular huff that you notice only because everything else is so still, and you slow your pace further so that even your breathing becomes a part of the quiet, a rhythm that matches the drip and the lapwing call and the distant, almost inaudible rustle of the willows. Now you can see the osier bed clearly through the thinning sedge, a wide, low-lying field that slopes gently towards the river, its entire surface dotted with the stools of last year's coppice, each stool a low, knotted base from which a spray of withies rises, straight and bare and shining with wetness. The colours of the withies are muted by the grey light, but still distinct, ranging from a pale straw yellow on the newest growth to a deep reddish-brown on the older rods, and some are a greenish olive that seems to glow faintly against the darker water that stands between the rows. The bed is laid out in a rough grid, the stools spaced about 3 feet apart, and narrow channels have been dug between the rows to carry away the floodwater, though today these channels are full to the brim and the water is moving so slowly it might as well be still. You step out of the sedge and onto the headland, a narrow strip of slightly dry ground that runs along the edge of the osier bed, and here you stop again, adjusting the palm guard on your right hand, loosening the billhook in its sheath so that it will draw smoothly when needed. The rain, which had almost ceased, now begins again with a little more purpose, a fine but steady fall that dimples the surface of the water between the stools and makes a soft hissing sound as it passes through the withy rods. You lift your face to it for a moment, feeling the coolness on your skin, and then you pull the hat brim lower, tighten the scarf around your neck, and step down off the headland into the shallow flood that covers the osier bed, the cold water seeping slowly through the seams of your boots until it reaches your feet, a sensation that is shocking for only a second before it becomes just another fact of the day, like the grey light or the sound of the rain or the weight of the basket in your hand. The first row of stools stands before you, their withy rods tall and straight, and you walk slowly along the row, your legs pushing through the knee-deep water with a sound like a slow stream, your eyes moving from rod to rod, assessing, selecting, already beginning the day's work in your mind. The withies glisten, each bead of water a tiny lens, and the smell of willow bark is strong here, a sharp, clean scent that cuts through the general dampness and fills your head with the promise of good cutting. You reach the far end of the row, where the water is slightly deeper and a clump of reed mace stands, with its last year's heads burst into brown fluff. And there you turn and look back at the bed spread out before you, the stools waiting, the day stretching ahead, and nothing in the world moves faster than the slow drip of the rain. You step off the narrow track where the sedge gives way, and the full expanse of the osier bed opens before you like a room without walls, its ceiling the low grey cloud, its floor a sheet of shallow water that stretches to the river's bend and beyond into mist. The transition from the close, rustling tunnel of sedge to this wide, quiet space is felt first, in the way the air moves differently, no longer funneled and close, but open and slow, carrying the clean scent of willow bark and the faint, metallic smell of standing water. Your boots sink into the headland's soft mud, and you stand for a long moment simply looking, letting your eyes travel along the rows of stools that march away from you in orderly lines, their bare withies rising straight as hairs from a brush, each one tipped with a tiny bud that will not open for another month. The osier bed is laid out with a care that speaks of many generations of planting and coppicing, the stools set in a grid that follows the gentle slope of the land towards the river, each one a low, gnarled base the size of a small barrel, from which between 12 and 20 rods have grown over the past year. The oldest stools, those nearest the river, are massive and knotted, their bases cracked into deep fissures where dark water gathers, and their roots must reach down through the peat into the clay below, holding fast against the winter floods that come every year without fail. The younger stools, planted perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, are smaller and neater, their rods finer, their bases smooth and tight. All of them stand in water that is never deeper than your knees and never shallower than your ankles, a depth that is perfect for willow, which loves to have its feet wet and its crown in the sun. Though today there is no sun, only the endless filtered grey of a February sky. You begin to walk along the headland, which is a strip of slightly higher ground at the edge of the bed, just wide enough for a person and a barrow, and here the mud is firmer underfoot, packed by your own comings and goings through the winter. The headland is tufted with coarse grass bent flat by rain, and here and there a stone has been set as a stepping place, its surface dark with wet and dotted with the pale grey scales of old lichen. You pass the first row of stools without stopping, though your eyes run over them, noting the thickness of the rods, their colour, their straightness, for you are heading towards the far side of the bed where the withies have grown in a slight hollow that catches the floodwater and keeps it longer, producing rods that are particularly long and pliant, the kind the basket makers most desire for the finest work. The water in the main bed is clearer than the murky Rhines because the dense mat of willow roots filters it, and though it is stained a pale brown by the peat, you can see the bottom when you look closely, a carpet of rotted leaves and small stones and the dark, fibrous tops of the stool bases. Small bubbles rise occasionally from the mud and burst without sound, releasing a faint, earthy scent. A water beetle rows itself across the surface with legs that dimple the water in a pattern of tiny circles, and then it dives, vanishing into the brown with a flick so quick you might have imagined it. The rain has softened to a mizzle now, so fine it is more a wetness in the air than anything falling, and the surface of the water between the stools is smooth, except where the drips from the withies land, each one a tiny splash that sends out a ring which travels a few inches and then is gone. You reach the corner of the bed where a large old pollard willow stands on the bank of the river, not a stool for cutting, but a landmark tree, its massive knotted head a dark shape against the grey, its trunk hollowed by age into a cavity where owls sometimes roost. This tree is your turning point, and here you stop again, resting the basket on a dry tussock, and you take a slow look back across the osier bed the way you have come, your eyes tracing the faint path of your own footprints in the mud of the headland, each one already filling with water. The world is so quiet now that you can hear the river moving beyond the bank, a sound that is not a rush or a gurgle, but a deep, slow, continuous presence, like the breathing of the land itself, and with it comes the occasional sharp call of a moorhen, the distant bleat of a sheep from some unseen field, the infinite soft hiss of rain on water. Now you turn your attention fully to the bed before you, and you step down off the headland into the first row of stools. The water accepts your boot with a soft plash, and the cold seeps through the leather gradually, not a shock but a slow awareness that spreads from your toes to your ankles, and you pause, letting your weight settle, feeling the bottom firm underfoot, a mixture of clay and fine gravel that gives slightly but does not yield. The water here comes to just below your knees, and the withies rise on either side of you, forming a narrow corridor through which you will work for the next hour. Their bare rods, pale and dark by turns, some smooth as skin, others rough with tiny ridges where the bark has fissured during a dry spell last summer. You approach the first stool slowly, and before you touch any rods you stand before it, studying the way the withies have grown from the stool's head. The centre rods are the tallest, reaching well above your head, and they are as straight as any carpenter could wish, their thickness the width of your thumb at the base and tapering to a fine point that bends slightly under its own weight. The outer rods are shorter and more slender, some of them branching into 2 or 3 smaller shoots near the top, a sign that a late frost nipped the growing tip in May and forced it to divide, making them less useful for basket work, but still good for binding or for rough hurdles. You note all this without forming words, for it is the kind of knowledge that lives in your hands and your eyes, and does not need language. You see a rod, and you know its purpose, just as you know the weight of the billhook in your palm or the feel of the mud under your soles. You reach out now and take hold of the nearest rod, not near the base where it is thickest but halfway up, where it is supple enough to bend, but strong enough to resist. Your fingers close around the bark, which is cool and smooth and slightly waxy to the touch, and you give the rod a gentle pull downwards, feeling how it springs, how the stool's whole crown moves with it, how the other rods shiver and shed a shower of droplets onto the water. The test is a simple one. A good withy will bend in a smooth arc and return straight when released, while a poor one will kink or crack or feel brittle, and this rod passes the test, springing back with a soft whoosh that sends a fine spray into the air. You let go and wipe your hand on your coat, leaving a wet smear that fades quickly, and then you move around the stool to study it from the other side, where a clump of 3 rods has grown so close together they are almost fused at the base. These you will take together because separating them would damage the stool, and because they will make good stout ribs for baskets that must hold heavy loads. The stool is a living thing, and you treat it with the same quiet respect you would give to any creature that sustains you, knowing that if you cut correctly, it will grow again next year, sending up new shoots from the place where the old ones were taken, and the stool will thicken and strengthen and produce better rods each season. You run your hand over the cut marks of previous years, a record of harvests written in the wood. Here the flat angle of a cut made 3 winters ago, healed over with a callus of smooth bark. There a slightly ragged scar where the billhook slipped on a frozen morning and took a small chip from the stool's crown. A scar that has darkened with age and now supports a tiny growth of pale green lichen. Each mark has a story, and you know them all, not as dates or events, but as a texture under your fingers, a map that guides your next cut. The selection process continues as you move from stool to stool along the row, touching, bending, assessing, and the rhythm of it is slow and repetitive, a meditation without thought. You note that the rods on the north side of each stool, the side that faces the river and catches the prevailing wind, are slightly shorter and thicker than those on the south side, and you adjust your selection accordingly, taking the longest rods for the basket makers who will split them into fine skeins for white work, and the shorter douter ones for those who make eel traps and lobster pots and other rough wares that require strength rather than grace. The withies that have grown near the ground, almost horizontal, are often the best of all, forced into a gentle curve by their own weight, and these you will set aside for bows and handles, for the parts of a basket that must hold a shape under strain. At the end of the row, where the water deepens to the middle of your thighs and the stools are spaced more widely apart, you pause to adjust the palm guard, which has slipped slightly, and you take a moment to look out across the flooded bed to the river beyond, a slow grey ribbon that moves without haste between banks of reed and willow. The river is high with winter rain, and its surface is broken by the occasional swirl of an eddy, the dark back of a fish rising unseen, and on the far bank you can just make out the shape of another osier bed, smaller than yours, where a single figure is moving among the stools, a neighbour you know by sight but will not speak to today, because the river is between you and the distance is too great for words. You raise a hand in greeting, a small gesture that is swallowed by the mist, and then you turn back to your own work, for the row is only half done, and the day is still young. The next stool is one of the oldest in the bed, a massive clump that has been coppiced for perhaps 50 years, its base as wide as a cartwheel and covered with a thick bark that is deeply grooved and home to a colony of tiny dark snails that cling to the cracks, their shells shut tight against the damp. The withies on this stool are extraordinary, as thick as a man's wrist at the base and so long that their tips brush the water when you pull them gently down, and they are a deep, rich red-brown that will blush to a warm chestnut when they are steamed and peeled. You circle the stool slowly, your legs pushing against the water which resists with a gentle pressure, and you count the rods that are ready, feeling the same quiet satisfaction that a farmer feels looking at a full field of wheat, a sense of provision, of the cycle turning, of the earth providing what is needed. Your hand reaches out again and again, testing rod after rod, and the day passes in this way without you noticing the passage of time, the only markers being the slow change of light from flat grey to a slightly brighter grey as the cloud thins overhead, and the gradual lessening of the rain until it stops altogether, for a long spell, leaving the air full of the sound of drips falling from every rod, every sedge blade, every branch of the old pollard, willow, a sound like 100 small clocks, all ticking at different speeds. You work your way down the row and then turn to begin the next, and the basket that you brought sits on the headland, still empty, for the cutting has not yet begun, and you want to be sure of every stool before you draw the billhook from its sheath, want to know exactly which rods will be taken and which will be left to grow another year, want to feel the whole bed mapped in your mind so that the cutting will be a single, flowing motion from stool to tissetation or mistake. And so you continue moving through the osier bed in the wet February light, your boots sinking and rising in a slow rhythm, your hands touching and releasing, your breath rising in steady clouds, and nothing disturbs the peace of the morning except the lapwings crying overhead, and the slow, ancient sound of the river moving past the willows towards the sea. You stand before the first stool of the row and the world narrows to the space of an arm's reach, the grey light falling evenly on the withies, so that each rod is distinct against the water and the mud and the pale sedge beyond, and you begin the slow work of reading what the year has grown. There is no hurry in this, because the selection is the foundation of everything that follows, the quiet judgment that separates a good bundle from a poor one, and though you have done it so many times that the knowledge lives in your fingers more than your mind, you still give each stool the full attention it deserves, as though you were meeting it for the first time. The morning has settled around you now, the rain paused, the mist lifting just enough to reveal the full extent of the osier bed stretching away in its grid of grey water and brown rods, and the only movement is the slow drift of your own reflection when you shift your weight and send a ripple travelling out between the rows. You reach for the nearest rod on the stool, and you do not grab it, but rather let your hand rest lightly on the bark, feeling the texture first, because texture tells you more than thickness or length ever could. A good withy for the basket makers must be smooth, its bark unbroken by disease or insect, and as you run your fingers up from the base towards the tip, you are feeling for the tiny bumps that would indicate a borer has been at work inside, or the rough patches where winter frost has split the outer skin, or the slight stickiness that means the sap is already rising early and the rod will be too brittle when dried. This rod is clean, its surface as smooth as polished horn under a faint bloom of greyish dust that wipes away at your touch, leaving a brighter band of colour beneath, a warm ochre that glows against the dull day. You bend the tip gently, watching how the curve forms, and it bends in a perfect arc without a hint of flatness or kink, springing back when you release it with a soft shiver that sends droplets flying onto the water in a scattered ring. The second rod on this stool is different, a brown withy, of the kind the basket makers use for ribs and frames, thicker at the base and darker in colour, its bark a deep reddish brown that has a slight sheen of its own, as though it were polished from within. You take it between both hands now, one near the base and one at the midpoint, and you flex it against itself, feeling the resistance, which is strong and even, the sign of a rod that has grown slowly through a cool summer and developed a dense, close grain. This one will not snap under the strain of bending into a basket frame, and you nod to yourself a small motion that no one sees, and set the rod aside in your mind as chosen. The third rod is thinner and paler, almost white at its upper reaches, and when you bend it the tip nearly touches the base without cracking, making it a prime candidate for the fine work, for the skeins that will be split and shaved and woven into the sides of a basket meant for gathering eggs or holding sewing things, the sort of basket that a woman in the village will carry on her arm to market. You work your way around the stool in a slow half circle, your legs moving through the water with a sound like a gentle stream, and each rod receives the same careful examination, the same touch and bend and visual assessment, until you have built a picture of the whole stool in your mind, knowing which rods will be taken and which will be left to grow another year. The rods that are too short, no longer than your arm, you will leave because they have not yet reached their full potential, and another season will add the length that makes them valuable. The rods that are forked or kinked, the ones that were damaged by wind or late frost, you will cut anyway because leaving them would crowd the new growth, but they will go into a separate pile for rough work, for hurdles and wattle, and the kind of basket that carries turnips from the field and does not need to be beautiful. The rods that are perfect, and there are many of them on this stool, you mark in your memory by the way they stand slightly apart from the others, by the particular bend of their tips against the grey sky. You step to the next stool now, and this one is younger, planted perhaps 8 years ago, its base still neat and compact, and its rods are finer and more numerous, a fountain of slender wands that rise to chest height and sway slightly in the faint breeze that has begun to move across the bed. The colour of these rods is a pale olive green, the colour of new willow bark before it has weathered to brown, and they are so straight that you could sight down them like an arrow and find no deviation. You run your hand through the whole clump, letting the rods slide between your fingers like the strings of a harp, and the sound they make is a soft shushing that is one of the quiet pleasures of this work, a sound that speaks of health and vigour and good growing. On this stool nearly every rod is ready, and your selection is a matter of choosing the thickest and longest and leaving the thinner ones for next year, A simple thinning rather than a full harvest, because a young stool must be treated gently if it is to develop the strong crown that will produce heavy crops for decades to come. The process repeats, stool after stool, and the repetition is not boring, but rather a kind of deepening, as each repetition layers over the last until you are no longer thinking about what you were doing, but simply doing it. Your hands moving with the sureness of long practice, your eyes traveling over the rods with the same attention a reader gives to a familiar page, seeing nothing new, but understanding everything. The water around your legs has warmed slightly from your body heat, or perhaps you have simply stopped noticing the cold, and the weight of your wet coat on your shoulders has become a part of you, as much a part of your body as your arms and your hands. The light continues to change by increments, the cloud thinning to a higher, paler grey that holds the promise of a sun it will not deliver, and the mist that hung over the river has lifted entirely now, so that you can see the far bank clearly, a dark line of trees and the occasional flash of a white swan moving upstream, with the slow dignity of its kind. At the end of the second row you pause to straighten your back, placing your hands on your hips and arching slightly, feeling the stretch in the muscles that have been bent forward for a long time, and you look out over the bed and see the work still ahead, the many stools still untouched, and the sight does not discourage you because the day is long and the work is steady and there is no point in counting what remains. You take a drink from a small leather bottle that you carry in an inner pocket of your coat, the water cold and tasting faintly of the peat from which it was drawn, and you eat a small piece of the bread from your basket, tearing it off with your fingers and chewing it slowly while you stand there with the water lapping at your thighs and the lapwings calling overhead in their thin, trembling voices. Now you turn your attention to a stool that has been growing near the edge of the bed, where the ground rises slightly towards the headland and the water is shallower, and this stool has a different character from the others, its rods shorter and thicker, their bark a dark, almost purple-brown, and their bases covered with a fine moss that has grown during the wet winter. You kneel in the water to examine this one more closely, because the moss is a sign that the stool has been too wet for too long, and some of the rods may have begun to rot at the base, a soft brown decay that would make them useless for anything except burning. You scrape the moss away with your thumb, and underneath the bark is firm and sound, the wetness only surface deep, and you are relieved. Though relief is too strong a word for the mild satisfaction you feel, a quiet confirmation that all is well. These rods, you decide, will be cut for the eel trap makers because their stoutness and slight natural curve are exactly what is needed for the hoops that hold the trap open against the current. The morning passes in this fashion, a slow progression from stool to stool, row to row, and the pattern of your movements becomes as regular as breathing. The pause before each stool, the first touch, the bending of the tip, the running of the fingers along the bark, the decision made without words, the turning to the next, and always the water moving around your legs with its gentle resistance. Always the drip of the Withies, always the soft grey light that makes no shadows and asks nothing of you. You notice the small things as you work, because there is nothing larger to notice, the way a single yellow leaf from last autumn still clings to one rod and flutters when you brush past it, the way a spider has spun a tiny web between two rods, its threads beaded with droplets so fine they are more mist than water, the way a frog sits motionless on the headland, its brown body exactly the color of the mud, its throat pulsing slowly as it breathes. By the time you reach the far side of the bed, where the stools are oldest and the water deepest, you have read every rod in 3 full rows, and your hands are stained a faint brown from the bark, a stain that will take days to fade, and your coat is wet through on the outside but still warm within, and your stomach is beginning to make itself known, a faint hollow feeling that tells you the morning has stretched into midday without your noticing. You wade back to the headland, the water shallowing with each step until you step out onto the firm mud with a squelch, and you sit down on a tussock of coarse grass that is just dry enough to serve, your legs stretched out before you, your boots streaming water, and you unwrap the linen cloth from the basket to find the bread and the cheese and the onion waiting, and you eat slowly, looking out over the bed that you have half read and half selected, the Withies standing in their rows like a congregation waiting for a blessed plensig. The morning has passed through its slow brightening and the grey sky has settled into a steady, even tone that will not change now until the late afternoon begins its gradual fade towards dusk. And you stand at the headland looking at the rows of stools you have already read, your hands stained with the faint brown of willow bark, the decision of which rods to take now complete in your mind, so that the next part of the work can begin without hesitation. You reach down to your belt and loosen the billhook from its leather sheath, drawing it out with a smooth pull that makes a soft, dry sound, and the curved blade catches what little light there is, a brief flash of silver against the grey. The handle is worn to the shape of your grip, the wood darkened by years of sweat and rain, and it settles into your palm as though it belongs there, which it does, having been hung on your hook by the cottage door every evening and taken down every morning for more seasons than you can count. You test the edge with a careful thumb, not pressing hard enough to cut, but just enough to feel the bite, and it is still sharp from the whetstone work you did 2 days ago, the edge biting into the soft pad of your thumb with a cold, clean promise. You step down from the headland into the first row, the water accepting your weight with a soft gulp, and you move towards the first stool you had marked in your mind, the one with the tall, straight whites that will go to the basket makers for their finest work. The water comes to just below your knees here, and as you stop in front of the stool, the withies rise around you like the bars of a gentle cage, their tips nodding slightly in a breeze that is too faint to feel on your face. You take a moment to settle your feet, feeling the bottom through your boot soles, a firm mixture of clay and small gravel that gives a little, but will hold you steady through the work. The air is cold and damp and smells of peat and wet wool, and the clean, sharp scent of willow, and somewhere behind you a moorhen calls once and then falls silent. You select the first rod with your left hand, gripping it not at the base but a little way up where it is supple enough to pull without snapping, and you pull it gently away from the stool to expose the place where it joins the crown, a slight swelling of darker bark that marks the point of origin. The billhook comes up in your right hand, and you set the blade against that spot, finding the angle with a precision that requires no thought, the flat of the blade resting briefly against the stool's old wood, while the curved edge bites into the base of the rod with a single, decisive stroke that cuts through the outer bark and into the pale, greenish wood beneath. The sound of the cut is not loud, but it is distinct, a dull, woody snick that carries a little way across the water and then is swallowed by the damp air, and the rod comes free in your hand with a slight resistance that gives way to sudden lightness as the last fibers part. You lay the cut withy carefully on the water beside you, where it floats with one end just touching the mud and the other resting on the surface, and you reach for the next rod without pausing, the motion already becoming a rhythm. The second cut is much like the first, though you adjust the angle slightly because this rod grows at a different slant, and the billhook's blade finds the same sweet spot at the junction of rod and crown, slicing through the base with a clean, sloping cut that will shed water and prevent rot from setting into the stool. You have learned over many years that a good cut is everything. Too flat, and the water will pool on the wound and the new shoots will be weak. Too steep, and you risk cutting into the old wood of the stool itself, damaging the source of next year's growth. The angle you use is one that has been taught by generations of withy cutters on these levels, passed from hand to hand without words, and it leaves a scar the size of a thumbprint that will heal over by summer and send up 3 or 4 new shoots in the spring. You lay the second rod beside the first, and they float together, pale and dark, their cut ends seeping a thin, clear sap that gleams for a moment before the water washes it away. You move around the stool slowly, your legs pushing through the water with a sound like a quiet stream, and you take rod after rod, the billhook rising and falling in a steady cadence that is neither fast nor slow, but exactly the pace that can be sustained from morning to evening, without tiring beyond the pleasant ache that comes from honest work. The motion is simple and repetitive. The left hand reaches, grips, and pulls. The right hand brings the blade to the base. The cut is made. The rod is laid on the growing pile that now floats beside you in a loose raft of withies, their colors ranging from pale straw to deep chestnut, their cut ends all facing the same way because you lay them with the butts together, a habit that makes bundling easier later. A habit that makes bundling easier later. Each cut sends a small shiver through the stool, and the remaining rods tremble and shed a fine spray of droplets that catch the grey light like a handful of tiny glass beads thrown into the air, falling back onto the water with a soft patter that blends into the general sound of the morning. The work continues, stool after stool, and the repetition is not monotonous, but rather a kind of deepening, each cut layering over the last until you are no longer aware of yourself as separate from the motion. Your body moving through the osier bed with the same unthinking grace that a bird moves through air or a fish through water. You notice the small variations without attending to them, the way a thicker rod requires a slightly harder stroke, the way a rod that has grown close to its neighbor must be wiggled free after cutting, the way the blade's edge begins to dull almost imperceptibly, so that you adjust the force of each cut by a fraction, compensating without calculation. The pile of cut withies grows longer and wider, and you gather it occasionally with a sweep of your arm, pulling the floating rods into a tighter bunch so they do not drift away among the other stools. At the end of the first row, you pause for a moment, straightening your back and lifting your face to the sky, which has not changed in any noticeable way, but which feels different because you are warm now from the work, a gentle heat that rises from your chest and spreads to your arms and legs, keeping the cold at bay, despite the water that still laps at your knees. You look back along the row and see the stools you have harvested, their crowns now bare except for the few rods you left standing for next year's growth, and the sight is satisfying in a quiet way, the satisfaction of order imposed on wild growth, of provision made for the months ahead. The cut rods float in their neat raft, and the water around the stools is stirred into a faint muddiness that will settle in an hour, leaving no trace of your passage except the cut marks on the wood and the footprints in the clay that will dissolve with the next rain. You turn to the second row now, wading across the shallow channel that runs between the rows, and the water deepens slightly in the channel, rising to your mid-thigh for a few steps before shallowing again as you reach the stools. This row is the one with the younger stools, the ones you decided to thin rather than harvest fully, and you adjust your approach accordingly, taking only the thickest and longest rods from each stool and leaving the thinner ones standing, their tips bright against the grey. The billhook feels lighter now, or perhaps your arm has simply grown accustomed to its weight and the cuts come more easily, each one a clean separation that leaves the stool looking neat and balanced, like a head of hair that has been trimmed by a knowing hand. You work your way down the row with the same steady pace, your breath rising in slow clouds that drift behind you and merge with the mist that still clings to the edges of the bed, and the only sounds of the snick of the blade, the soft plash of the rods as they join the raft, and the endless, gentle dripping of water from the withies that remain. A heron rises from the riverbank as you reach the middle of the row, its great grey wings beating slowly, and you pause to watch it climb into the air with a few heavy strokes before it sets its wings and glides downstream, its long legs trailing behind it, its neck folded into a tight curve. The sight is familiar, something you have seen 1,000 times, but it never fails to draw your eye, a moment of slow grace against the unchanging grey, and then the heron is gone around the bend and you return to your work, the billhook finding its rhythm again, as though it had never paused. The third row takes you into the deeper water near the river's edge, where the stools are oldest and the withies are thickest and longest, the ones you marked for the eel trap makers and the lobster pot weavers. And here the work is harder because the rods resist the blade more strongly, their dense wood requiring a firmer stroke and a sharper angle. You pause more often to test the edge of the billhook with your thumb, and once you stop entirely to take a small whetstone from your coat pocket and give the blade a few quick passes. A metallic ringing sound that rises high and thin and then fades as you wipe the blade on your sleeve and return to cutting. The raft of cut rods has grown so large now that you can no longer keep it together with one arm, so you gather it in sections, pulling the floating withies towards you and stacking them on a drier patch of ground at the end of the row, where you will bundle them later, their wet bark gleaming dully in the flat light. As you work through the deep water, your movements become slower and more deliberate, not from fatigue, but from the care required to handle rods that are as thick as your wrist at the base, and must be cut with a single clean stroke to avoid splitting the wood. You grip each rod firmly with your left hand, pulling it down and away from the stool to expose the base, and you set the billhook high on the crown, almost at the point where the rod flares into the old wood. And you make the cut with a sharp, decisive pull that uses the full curve of the blade, a slicing motion rather than a chopping one. and the rod comes away with a soft crack that is deeper in tone than the snick of the thinner rods. These thick withies are heavy, and when you lay them on the water, they sink slightly before rising again, their weight pulling the raft down at one corner until you redistribute the load. The morning has definitely passed now, though you have no way of knowing the hour except by the quality of the light, which has shifted from the flat grey of early day to a slightly warmer grey that hints at a sun somewhere above the cloud, a brightness that does not illuminate so much as it lessens the gloom. Your stomach reminds you again that it is time to eat, but you are near the end of a row and you want to finish it before resting. So you continue for another few stools, the billhook rising and falling, the rods piling up behind you, until the last stool of the row is harvested, and you stand for a moment in the quiet, your arms hanging at your sides, the blade dripping water onto the surface, in a slow, steady beat. You wade back to the headland, where the raft of cut withies now lies in a long, tidy heap on the mud, their colours muted by the grey light, but still lovely in their variation. The pale straw and the warm ochre and the deep reddish brown all mingled together like the colours of a winter hedgerow. You sit down on the same tussock where you sat earlier, and you take the whetstone from your pocket again, giving the billhook a more thorough sharpening. Now, the stone moving in slow circles over the curved edge, the sound a soft rhythmic hiss that blends with the dripping of the withies and the distant call of the lapwings. When the blade is sharp enough to shave the hair from your arm, you wipe it clean with an oiled rag and lay it across your knees, and you unwrap the linen cloth from the basket to find the bread and cheese and onion once more, the food simple and good, and you eat slowly while the river moves past beyond the willows, and the grey sky holds its silence and the afternoon stretches ahead of you, long and quiet and full of the same steady work. The heap of cut withies lies on a patch of drier ground near the headland, a wide scattering of rods that glisten with the last of the rain, their colours ranging from pale straw to deep chestnut, and you survey the pile with the same quiet assessment you gave each stool before the cutting began, knowing that the bundling is the final measure of the day's work, the point where the scattered becomes ordered and the raw becomes ready. The stool that serves as your seat is an old upturned willow log set near the edge of the bed many years ago, its surface worn smooth by the weight of countless sittings, its bark long gone so that the wood beneath is a silver grey, streaked with darker lines of weather stain, and it is solid and dry enough despite the damp air, offering a place to settle your weight after the hours of slow wading. You sit now with the log beneath you and the pile of withies before you, and you begin the work of gathering the cut rods into bundles, each bundle a precise measure that the basket makers will recognize and expect. 25 rods to a bolt, no more, no less, a number that has been settled by custom and convenience and the span of a man's 2 hands. The first thing you do is reach among the heap and select a slender, extra flexible willow wand, one of the thin green withies that you cut from the edges of the young stools, its length as long as your outstretched arm and its thickness no greater than your smallest finger. This will be the tie, and you test its pliancy by bending it into a loop, watching how it curves without cracking, how the fibers compress on the inside of the bend and stretch on the outside without tearing, and satisfied you lay it across your knee when you begin to assemble the first armful. You lean forward from the log, your back bending at the waist with the ease of long habit, and you gather the cut rods one by one from the heap, drawing them towards you with a soft, rustling sound that is the whisper of bark sliding against bark, and as you gather, you count silently, your lips not moving, your mind keeping the tally in a way that has become as automatic as breathing. 1 rod, 2 rods, 3, each one added to the bundle that rests across your thighs, the butts aligned on one end so that the thicker cut ends form a rough plane and the fine tips taper together at the other, and the bundle grows in your arms until it is a thick sheaf that you can just encircle with both hands. When you reach 25, you pause and hold the bundle together, pressing it against your chest while your free hand picks up the willow tie from your knee. And now comes the part of the work that requires a certain deftness, a coordination of hand and foot and body that you learned so long ago you can no longer remember the learning. You place the bundle on the ground before you, setting it upright with the butt ends down on the mud, and you lean it against your shins while your foot comes forward to brace it, the sole of your boot pressing against the base of the bundle to hold it steady. The willow tie you wrap once around the whole sheaf, about a hand's length down from the top, and you pull it tight, seeing how the bundle compresses, how the individual rods shift and settle against each other with small creaking sounds, and you twist the two ends of the tie together in a simple crossing motion that makes the green bark bite into itself and hold fast. The first twist is not enough, so you pull again, using the strength of your shoulders in a slow, steady tension that you feel all the way down your arms. And when the tie is as tight as it will go, you tuck the loose ends under the wrapped band, not with a knot, because a knot would loosen when the wood dries and shrinks, but with a simple folding under that uses the friction of the bark against itself to lock everything in place. The finished bundle stands on its butt end, a tight cylinder of withies that holds its shape without support, and you lift it with one hand to feel the weight, a satisfying heft that tells you the rods are dense and full of good fibre. You carry it the few steps to the headland and lay it down on its side, the cut ends pointed towards the drove road so that when the bundles are collected the carter will know at a glance which end is which, and you align it carefully with an imaginary line that runs parallel to the osier bed, a line that will become a neat row by the time you are finished. The first bundle of the day is always a small landmark, a visible beginning, and you stand for a moment looking at it lying there on the mud, with the grey light falling evenly on its pale butt ends and the darker tips, and then you turn back to the heap and the log and begin again. The second bundle follows the same pattern, but you vary the selection of the tie, choosing a slightly thicker withy this time, one that has a natural spiral twist in its grain, a peculiarity that will make it grip even tighter as it dries, and you set about gathering the next 25 rods, your hands moving through the pile with a sorting motion that separates the rods by length and thickness without conscious thought, putting the longest and straightest into this bundle because these will go to the basket makers who produce the largest wares, the rhythmic. The counting is a rhythm now, a soft repetition in the back of your mind that runs alongside the physical work, and the numbers stack up quietly, each 5 a small completion, each 10 a larger one, until you reach 25, and the bundle is ready for tying. You lay the tie around the rods and brace them with your foot, and you pull the twist tight, feeling the slight give of the green wood as it compresses, and you tuck the ends under with a push of your thumb that has become calloused in that exact spot from years of the same motion, a small hard pad of skin that fits perfectly against the folded end of the tie. This bundle joins the first on the headland, laid parallel and close, the two of them now a pair that will soon become a row, and you return to the log and the heap and the slow, steady work of the afternoon. The third bundle you make from the shorter rods, the ones that will be used for binding and for the finer parts of small baskets, and these rods are more numerous in the heap because every stool produces more of them than of the long straight whites, so you find that gathering 25 goes quickly, the thinner rods sliding together with a high, crisp sound, unlike the deeper rustle of the thicker ones. The tie for this bundle is a withy so slender and flexible that you can wrap it twice around the sheaf, doubling the hold, and when you tighten it, the bundle becomes a compact little bolt that you could almost close your hand around, its lightness a contrast to the heavier bundles already lying on the headland. The sun has still not appeared, but the cloud has thinned further, so that the light now is a soft, diffuse brightness that seems to come from everywhere at once, and the water on the osier bed reflects this brightness as a pale silver sheen that shifts and ripples when the breeze touches it, and in this light, every detail of the work stands out clearly. The grain of the wood, the texture of the bark, the dark mud on your hands, the neat row of bundles growing steadily along the headland. As you work, you notice the way each bundle has its own character, its own particular arrangement of colors and textures, because no two withies are exactly alike even when they grow from the same stool, and as you gather them together you are in a small way composing a picture, balancing the red browns against the olive greens, the rough against the smooth, the straight against the slightly curved, until each bolt is not just a collection of rods but a small harmonious whole. This is not something you think about in words, but your hands know it, and they sort and select and arrange with an instinct that has been shaped by the expectations of the basket makers who will steam and split these withies into skeins, and who will judge your work by the evenness of the bundles and the quality of the ties. The fourth bundle, and the fifth come in quick succession, the rhythm of the work now fully established, a cycle of gathering, counting, wrapping, twisting, tucking, and carrying that loops around on itself without break, and the heap of cut rods on the ground grows smaller as the row on the headland grows longer. A slow transfer of mass from the wild to the ordered, from the scattered to the contained. Your body moves in a comfortable, almost dreamlike state, the motions so familiar that your mind is free to wander, and it wanders not to concerns or worries, but to small observations of the world around you. The way a flock of starlings wheels over the river in a dark, shape-shifting cloud. The way a single raindrop that had been clinging to a withy tip finally lets go and falls with a tiny flash of light. The way your own breath has become so steady that it matches the soft switch of the rod sliding together, as though your body sank theatricness. You pause after the sixth bundle to stand and stretch your back fully, placing your hands on the small of your spine and pressing gently, feeling the vertebrae realign with a series of small soft clicks that are satisfying without being dramatic. And you walk a few steps along the headland to look at the row of bundles lying there. 7 of them now, their butt ends all perfectly aligned, their tips a feathery fringe that stirs slightly in the breeze. The sight is a quiet satisfaction, a visible record of the afternoon's progress, and you count them once with your eyes even though you know the number by heart. A small ritual of confirmation that belongs to the work as much as the cutting and the tying. You drink from the leather bottle again, the water now tasting of nothing but the coolness of the day, and you eat the last of the bread, a small piece of crust that you chew slowly while you watch the river move in its ancient, unhurried way, carrying a twig and a cluster of brown leaves and a single white feather that spins slowly in an eddy, before continuing downstream. Returning to the log, you settle yourself again and pull the remaining heap of withies closer with a sweep of your arm, and you begin the 7th bundle, then the 8th, and the afternoon wears on in this gentle, repetitive fashion, the pile diminishing, the row growing, the light beginning its slow descent towards the grey dusk that will come early in this short February day. The binder ties you use grow scarcer as you work because you selected only a handful of the very finest flexible ones from the young stools, and now you must be more careful in your choices, using shorter ties and wrapping them twice when the length allows, or combining 2 slender withies twisted together to make a stronger cord, a technique you save for the largest bundles where the strain on the tie will be greatest. The 9th bundle is one of these, a heavy bolt of the thickest brown withies destined for the strongest work, and it requires all your strength to pull the double tie tight, your foot braced hard against the butt ends, your shoulders straining, and when it is done, you feel a small quiet pride in the firmness of the bundle, the way it stands solid on its end, without the slightest give. The 10th bundle and the 11th follow, and now the afternoon is waning, the light taking on a bluish cast that deepens the shadows in the ruts and hollows of the headland, and the air grows perceptibly colder, so that you can feel the chill on your cheeks and the tips of your ears even through the warmth of the work. You quicken your pace not at all, because there is no urgency, only the steady continuation of the task, and the 12th bundle is tied and carried to the row, then the 13th, and by now the heap is reduced to a small litter of odd rods, the ones that were too short or too curved to go into the standard bundles, and these you gather into a final loose armful that you will take back to the cottage for your own use, for kindling perhaps or for mending a wattle panel in the garden fence. Nothing wasted, everything finding its place. The row of bundles on the headland is a neat line now, each bolt touching the next with a uniformity that pleases the eye, and you walk slowly along the row one last time, checking each tie with a tug of your thumb, making sure that no loose ends have worked free, that the butt ends are all flush, that the bundles are ready for the cart and the journey to the basket makers in the villages downstream. The last tie you check is the one on the heavy brown bundle, and you find it still tight and true, and you nod to yourself once, a small, private acknowledgement, and then you gather up the loose rods and the empty basket and the leather bottle and the linen cloth, and you stack the bundles a little closer together so that the carter will find them easily, their cut ends all pointed the same way, their tips a soft fringe against the darkening mud. The osier bed is quiet now, the stools standing in the shallow water with their heads bare where you have cut them, looking somehow smaller than they did this morning, more humble, and the water between the rows is still, except where a late moorhen paddles with a jerking motion of its head, leaving a wake that rocks the few fallen leaves floating on the surface. You take one last look at the bed before you turn away, seeing the work that remains for another day, the rows you have not yet touched, and the sight does not trouble you because the work is endless, and that is its comfort, the promise that there will always be another row, another stool, another February of rain and mist, and the clean, sharp smell of willow bark. You lift the basket and the loose rods onto your shoulder, and you begin the walk back along the headland towards the drove, leaving the bundles lying in their quiet row like a sentence written in wood, a message of provision sent forward to the hands that will open them and split them and weave them into the shapes of daily life. The work pauses, and you do not decide to pause so much as your body simply arrives at the moment when the bundling is done and the next task has not yet begun. A small gap in the rhythm of the day that belongs to rest. The row of tie bolts lies along the headland in its neat procession, and you stand beside them for a long breath, feeling the weight of the morning's motion settle into your shoulders and your lower back, a tiredness that is not unpleasant, but rather a kind of warmth that spreads outward from the center of you into your arms and legs, and you turn slowly away from the osier bed to look out over the wider levels. The cloud has thinned to a high, even veil through which a pale disk of sun tries to push, not breaking through but making a brighter patch of grey that moves slowly across the flooded fields, and where it passes the water, takes on a faint pewter gleam that shifts and fades as the light moves on, a slow sweep of brightness that travels from east to west without hurry. You walk along the headland towards the place where the track to the drove road meets the riverbank, and here there is a dry tussock of coarse grass that rises a little above the general mud, its blades bent and flattened by the winter, but still thick enough to make a seat that keeps the damp from seeping through your coat. The tussock sits near the edge of a deep rhine, one of the main drainage channels that carries water from the upper levels down towards the river, and its surface is dark and still, the color of cold tea, with a faint skin of pollen or dust that has gathered in the hours since the last rain. On the far bank of the Rhine a single willow tree leans out over the water, its bare branches reflected so perfectly that it seems to be growing both up and down at once. A grey cage of twigs that trembles slightly when a breath of wind passes and then stills again. You settle yourself on the tussock, your back against a low mound of earth that supports you at just the right angle, your legs stretched out before you, with the boots still wet and steaming faintly in the slightly warmer air. And you let out a long breath that you did not know you had been holding, a soft sigh that is taken by the damp air and carried away into the reeds. The linen cloth that wraps your food is damp on the outside from the mist and the rain, but when you unfold it on your knee, the inside is dry and the bread and cheese and onion are as they were when you packed them in the dark of the cottage before first light, simple and unbruised and ready. You take the bread first, a round flat cake of barley flour that was baked 3 days ago on the hearthstone, its crust dark and its crumb dense and slightly sour, and you break off a piece with your fingers, feeling the rough texture of the crust and the softer give of the inside. The cheese is a hard wedge, pale yellow and sharp smelling, and you cut a slice from it with the small knife you keep in your coat pocket, a blade that is reserved for this purpose and never used on the Withies. And you lay the cheese on the bread and take a bite that fills your mouth with the dry, nutty taste of the barley and the salt tang of the grey water and the grey-green line of the distant Quantock hills that are just visible now, as a faint smudge on the southern horizon where the cloud has lifted a little more. The onion is small and brown, its skin papery and loose, and you peel it with your thumb, the outer layers coming away in dry flakes that fall onto the mud at your feet. And the onion itself is white and crisp and sharp, and you bite into it as though it were an apple, the juice stinging your lips a little, the heat of it clearing your head in a way that the bread and cheese could not. You eat without hurry, each mouthful chewed until it is soft and flavourless, and between bites you rest your hands on your knees and watch the slow world around you, the way a single brown leaf drifts on the surface of the Rhine, caught in an eddy that makes it turn in slow circles, the way a wren hops among the exposed roots of the leaning willow, its small body a flicker of brown against the grey, its tail cocked at a sharp angle, the way the pale disk of the sun moves behind the grey crusty sap the wasp. The rest is a quiet space in the middle of the day, and you do not fill it with thought or planning or any kind of mental work, because the body needs stillness as much as the mind does, and you have learned over many years that the work goes better when the rest is truly rest, not just a pause in motion, but a letting go of the slight tension that even the calmest work demands. Your hands lie open on your thighs, the palms up, the fingers slightly curled, and the skin of your palms is creased with fine lines that the cold water has made more pronounced. And the calluses at the base of your fingers are a pale yellow against the pink of the rest of your hand. And you notice these things without interest, just as you notice the way your breath has slowed and the way your eyelids have grown heavy without closing. The moor hens have returned to the Rhine while you have been sitting there. 2 of them, their dark bodies moving with a jerking, nodding motion, their red beaks dipping into the water and coming up with small morsels you cannot see. And they make a soft clucking sound to each other that carries across the still water with a clarity that seems too large for such small birds. They do not notice you, or if they do not care, and they paddle slowly along the far bank, their wakes crossing and merging, and then they vanish into a clump of reed mace, and the water is still again. The lapwings that were crying overhead have moved on now, and in their place a single curlew calls from somewhere far out on the moor, a long bubbling note that rises and falls and rises again like water over stones, and the sound is so much a part of this place that you hear it without hearing it, the way you hear your own heartbeat when you are still enough. You finish the last of the bread and the last of the cheese and the last crisp bite of the onion, and you gather the crumbs from the linen cloth with a careful finger, dropping them onto the mud for the birds or the insects or whatever small creature will find them, and you fold the cloth into a neat square and tuck it back into the basket. The leather bottle is still half full, and you drink from it again, the water cold and tasting faintly of the peat, and you hold the last mouthful for a moment before swallowing, feeling the coolness spread down your throat and into your chest. Then you sit for a little while longer, because the rest is not yet over, and there is no reason to end it before it is complete, and you let your gaze drift out across the levels to the distant line of the poldens and the nearer clumps of alder and willow that mark the course of the river, and you think nothing, or nothing, that can be shaped into words, only a general awareness of the grey light and the slow water and the quiet steady breathing of the land. The tools are still at your belt, the billhook in its sheath and the palm guard still on your hand, and after a time you reach down and take a small pot from your coat pocket, a little wooden pot with a lid that screws on, and inside is a smear of mutton fat mixed with a drop of linseed, a simple grease that you use to keep the blade from rusting in the damp. You draw the billhook from its sheath and lay it across your knee, and you take a corner of the rag that you keep in the pot and rub the grease along the curved edge. A slow, careful motion that covers every inch of the steel with a thin, protective film, and the blade gleams dully in the grey light, and the smell of the mutton fat is faint and clean, and somehow comforting. You wipe your fingers on the rag and return the pot to your pocket, and you slide the billhook back into its sheath with a soft click, and now the tools are ready for the afternoon, and so are you. But still you do not rise, because the tussock is dry and the air is still, and the body is heavy with food and rest, and to sit here for a few more minutes will cost nothing, and will make the afternoon's work flow more smoothly. The pale disk of the sun has moved further behind the cloud, and the light has taken on a slightly warmer tone, not bright, but less cold than before, and the mist that has hung over the far fields all morning has begun to lift, revealing more of the landscape, the checkerboard of rhines and the darker patches of peat cuttings, and the single line of a drove road that runs arrow straight towards the horizon, where it disappears into a blur of distance. On that road, far away, a cart is moving, small as a beetle, its wheels sending up a faint spray of mud that you can just see if you squint, and you watch it for a while, the slow progress of something that is not yourself, and then it passes behind a clump of trees and is gone. A heron stands at the edge of the river now, its long legs like 2 reeds, its grey body so still that you might have mistaken it for a piece of driftwood if you had not seen it take a single step, just as you looked. A slow, deliberate placing of one foot in front of the other, and it stands there with its neck curved into its shoulders, watching the water with a patience that is older than the levels, older than the Withy beds, older than a human work. You watch the heron, and the heron watches the water, and for a long moment nothing moves, and then the bird dips its head with a sudden, fluid motion, and comes up with a small fish that flashes silver once, and is gone down the long throat, and the heron shakes its head once, and resumes its stillness. You rise from the tussock, slowly, Your legs a little stiff from sitting, and you bend once to touch your toes and feel the stretch run up the backs of your legs. And then you stand straight and look out over the osier bed one more time, seeing the stools waiting in their rows, the water still and grey between them, the bundles lying in their neat line on the headland, and you feel the rest settle into your bones as a quiet readiness, a calm that will carry you through the afternoon without hurry or strain. The billhook is at your hip, the palm guard is on your hand, the basket and the loose rods are waiting by the log, and the afternoon stretches ahead of you, grey and quiet and full of the same good work. You rise from the tussock with the slow, unfolding motion of a body that has rested well, the stiffness in your knees and the small of your back already loosening as you stand and take a first deep breath of the afternoon air, which has changed in a way you can feel more than describe, a slight thickening of the damp, a faint cooling at the edges, and you know without looking at any clock that the short February day has begun its long, slow descent towards evening. The pale disk of the sun behind the cloud has moved further to the west, and though it still gives no direct light, the quality of the grey has shifted once again, taking on a bluish, softer tone that deepens the shadows in the ruts of the headland and makes the water between the rows of stools look darker and more still than before. You gather the baskets and the loose rods with one arm, and with the other you adjust the palm guard that has settled into a comfortable groove on your hand, tightening the thong a little where it has stretched during the morning's work, and you begin to walk along the headland towards the far side of the osier bed where the denser clusters of stools wait untouched. Their Withy is dark thicket against the pale water. The afternoon's work stretches ahead of you in a way that is not daunting, but rather a quiet invitation, a continuation of the same steady rhythm you have held since first light, and you find that your body settles into it even more readily now than it did in the morning, because the rest has smoothed away the small resistances and the food has renewed the deep warmth at your center, and your arms and legs move with a fluid ease that comes only after several hours of sustained labor. The billhook slides from its sheath with the same soft, dry sound, and you step down off the headland into the water once more, feeling the cold seep through your boots with a familiarity that is almost a comfort, a sensation that belongs to this place and this work and this particular February day that is unlike any other, but also exactly like every other you have known. The stools on this side of the bed are older and have been coppiced for many more seasons than those near the drove road. Their base is broad and knotted with the scars of decades, some of them so wide that you could not encircle them with both arms, and their roots have pushed deep into the peat and the clay below, finding a hold that has withstood floods and droughts and the slow sinking of the land itself. The withies that grow from these old stools are denser and thicker than those on the younger plants, their bark a deep reddish-brown that is almost black at the base where the water has stained it, and they grow in tight clusters that must be approached with care because a hasty cut can damage 3 rods while trying to free one. You circle the first of these old stools slowly, your legs pushing against water that is deeper here, rising to your mid-thigh and pressing cold against the thick wool of your breeches, and you study the way the rods have arranged themselves, finding the gaps where your blade can reach, planning the order of your cuts before you make the first one. The first rod you select is a thick brown withy that grows from the center of the stool, and it requires a different approach from the morning's cutting because it is so dense and so firmly attached that a single stroke will not suffice. You set the blade against the base at the same careful angle you always use, but you make the cut in 2 motions. The first a firm push that severs the outer bark and half the wood, the second a sharp pull that finishes the job and leaves a clean, flat scar on the stool's crown, and the rod comes away with a low, dull crack that you feel in your hand as much as here. It is heavier than the withies you cut this morning, and when you lay it on the water it sinks for a moment before rising, its weight pulling the floating raft down at one corner until you redistribute the other rods to balance it. The second rod on this stool is even thicker, a withy that has grown for 2 seasons rather than 1. Its base as wide as your wrist, and its length so great that the tip brushes the water even when you hold it at shoulder height, and this one takes 3 strokes of the billhook, each one precise and patient, until it too comes free and joins the growing pile. You work your way around the old stool with a slower pace than you kept in the morning, not from fatigue, but from the respect that the old wood demands, each cut requiring a considered angle and a firm, controlled force that would become sloppy if you hurried. The blade of the billhook is holding its edge well, but you pause after every few rods to wipe it on the thigh of your breeches, cleaning away the small clinging fibers of bark and sap that would otherwise build up and make the cuts less clean. And once you stop to take the small pot of mutton fat from your coat and dab a fresh smear along the steel, rubbing it in with the oiled rag until the surface gleams dully in the grey light. The afternoon is colder than the morning was, or perhaps you are simply moving more slowly and generating less warmth, but the work itself keeps the chill at bay, and your hands remain nimble despite the cold water, the fingers finding their grip on the billhook's handle with the same sureness they had at dawn. The rhythm of the afternoon is different from the morning's rhythm in ways that are subtle but distinct. The light is lower and bluer, the water is deeper and colder, the rods are thicker and more resistant, and your own body is moving through the work with a deeper, slower cadence that matches the settling of the day. You notice these things without remarking on them, just as you notice the way the mist has returned in thin patches that drift low over the water. Not the dense fog of early morning, but a lighter haze that softens the edges of the stools and makes the far bank of the river seem more distant than it is. The moorhens have fallen silent now, and the lapwings have moved further out over the moor, and the only sounds are the steady snick of your blade, the soft plash of the cut rods hitting the water, and the endless gentle dripping from the withies that remain standing, a sound so constant that it has become a kind of silence in itself. You move from the first old stool to the second, and then to the third, and the afternoon progresses in this slow, methodical way, the pile of cut rods growing behind you in a long raft that you push along as you work, its weight now considerable enough that the water resists when you try to move it, and you must lean your shoulder into the task like a boatman poling a punt. The rods in the raft are mostly the thick browns and the sturdy reds, the withies that will go to the makers of heavy baskets and eel traps, and their colours are richer and darker than the pale whites you cut this morning, so that the raft looks like a floating patch of autumn leaves, all deep ochres and umbers, and the occasional flash of olive green where a younger rod found its way into the mix. At the end of the row you pause and straighten your back, placing your hands on your hips, and you look back over the work you have done since midday, the stools standing bareheaded in the deep water, their cut scars pale and fresh against the dark old wood, the raft of withies floating patiently where you have tethered it by jamming a cut rod into the mud. And the sight is a quiet measure of the afternoon's progress, a visible tally that needs no counting. The cloud overhead has thickened again, closing over the pale place where the sun had been trying to break through, and the light has dimmed by another degree, so that the world is now a uniform soft grey that makes it hard to tell where the water ends and the sky begins. And you know that you have perhaps 2 more hours of cutting before the dusk makes it too dark to work safely with a sharp blade. You turn to the next row and begin again, the billhook rising and falling, the rods coming free and joining the raft, and the work continues in its quiet, unbroken way, your body moving through the water with the slow, steady pace of a creature that belongs to this place, your mind empty of anything but the small, immediate details of the task, the feel of the bark under your left hand, the angle of the blade in your right, the soft resistance of the wood as the cut is made, the weight of the rod as you lay it on the water. The afternoon deepens, and the light falls, and the cold creeps a little closer, and still you work, stool after stool, row after row, until the far side of the bed is as bare as the near side, and the raft of cut withies has grown so large that it trails behind you like a floating garden, and you know that the cutting is nearly done for the day. You went back to that land, one last amans one mers. On to nightly for the maeston that thick clouds that merge with the mist, and you stand there for a moment, the billhook hanging loosely in your hand, looking at the great pile of rods that will need to be bundled, before the light fails entirely, and you feel the deep bundled be quiet, and the jakai kind from a full decide and get how I can it. The bundles lie along the headland in the orderly row you made them, 13 neat bolts of withies with their butt ends aligned, and their tips a feathery fringe that stirs slightly in the late afternoon breeze, and you stand beside them for a moment, taking a slow, full breath that draws the cold air deep into your lungs and releases it in a cloud that drifts away towards the river. The light has continued its slow fading, the soft bluish grey of the afternoon deepening now into a darker slate that makes the water in the Rhines look like strips of polished lead, and turns the distant pollard willows into black silhouettes against a sky that has no edges. And you know that you have perhaps an hour of useful vision left before the dusk makes fine work difficult, and the walk home becomes a journey in near darkness. There is no urgency in this knowing, only a quiet adjustment of pace, the same calm that has carried you through every other part of the day, settling now into the last of the tasks, and you begin the work of preparing the load for the basket makers with the same steady hands that cut and bundled these rods since the morning. The hand cart waits at the edge of the headland where you left it this morning, a simple two-wheeled conveyance made of ash and elm, its bed a flat platform of planks weathered to a silvery grey, its handles two long shafts that rest on the mud, and its wheels as solid discs of elm boards pegged together with oak dowels, their edges worn smooth and slightly flattened on one side from the countless journeys up and down the drove road. The cart has been with you for many years, and you know its every creak and groan. The way the left wheel wobbles slightly when the load is uneven. The way the right handle has a small split that you bound with a strip of willow 3 winters ago and has held ever since, and the way the whole thing settles into the ruts of the drove as though it were made for them, which it was. You approach the cart and lift the handles, swinging it around so that its bed faces the row of bundles, and you let the handles drop back to the mud with a soft thud. And then you take a moment to check the wheels, spinning each one slowly to make sure no stones have lodged in the rims and that the pegs are still tight, a habit that costs a few seconds and has saved you many a long walk home with a broken axle. The first bundle you lift is one of the heaviest, the bolt of thick brown withies, destined for the eel trap makers, and you bend your knees and take hold of it with both hands, one near the tie and one at the butt end, and you lift it to your chest in a smooth motion that you feel in your shoulders and the small of your back, a weight that is substantial but well within your strength. The bundle is cold and damp against your coat, and it drips a few last drops of water onto the mud as you carry it. The few paces to the cart, your boots making their soft squelching sound in the churned ground, and you lay it on the cart bed with its butt ends towards the front, pushing it flush against the low side rail so that it will not shift in transit. The second bundle follows, a lighter bolt of the pale whites, and you lift it with one arm, while your other hand steadies the top, and you lay it beside the first, its slender tips overlapping the heavy butts of the brown bundle like a fringe, and you pause to adjust the alignment, making sure that everything sits square and true, because a load that shifts on the drove can pull the cart sideways into a rhine, or spill its contents into the mud, and though neither would be a catastrophe, they would be a nuisance you prefer to adopt. The third and fourth bundles you carry together, one under each arm, because they are the smaller bolts of green binders and fine whites, and their weight is light enough that you can manage both without strain, though you walk more carefully, watching the ground before your feet to avoid a tussock or a hidden stone that might trip you. And you set them on the cart with the same careful alignment, building the load in layers that will hold each other in place. The fifth bundle is another heavy one, and the sixth and seventh are medium browns, and you lift and carry and place with a rhythm that is slower than the cutting was, but still steady, a kind of procession between the headland and the cart that leaves a trail of deep footprints in the mud, each one already filling with water that seeps up from the saturated ground. When the first layer of bundles covers the cart bed, you pause to assess the stacking, walking around the cart with a slow, considering eye, and you decide that the load will ride better if you crisscross the next layer, laying the bundles at a slight angle so that they brace against each other and against the side rails, forming a kind of interlocked mass that will not bounce apart on the rough stretches of the drove. You lift the eighth bundle, a large bolt of mixed rods, and you place it diagonally across the first layer, its butt end resting against the front rail and its tips trailing off the back corner, and you press down on it with both hands to feel how it settles, and the whole stack shifts slightly with a soft grinding sound of bark against bark, and then settles again, and you are satisfied. The ninth bundle goes on at the opposite diagonal, forming a cross with the eighth, and the 10th bundle fills the gap between them, and so the load builds layer upon layer, each bundle tested with a firm press of your hand before you turn back to the headland for the next. The work of loading is heavy but not hurried, and you feel the warmth of it rising through your body despite the cold air, a glow that begins in your chest and spreads to your arms and shoulders, and the sweat that had cooled on your skin during the bundling is replaced by a fresh warmth that is almost pleasant, the warmth of a body doing what it was made to do. Your breath rises in thick clouds that hang around your head for a moment, and then are torn away by the faint breeze that has sprung up from the river, a breeze that carries the smell of the open levels and the faint, salt tang of the distant sea beyond the estuary. And you welcome it because it means the mist will hold off for the walk home, and you will be able to see the drove before you. The 11th bundle and the 12th go onto the cart in the same careful way, and by the time you lift the 13th and final bundle, the load is a high, neat stack that rises almost to your chest, its colours a muted mosaic of ochre and brown and pale straw in the fading light, its shapes all angles and soft fringes, and it looks, you think, without forming the thought into words, like a small harvest monument, a temporary cairn built of Withies be gone from this place by tomorrow bay that Abner. You place the last bundle on the very top, pressing it down firmly, and the load shifts once more and then settles into its final shape, and you run your hand over the whole stack, feeling for any loose place, any bundle that might slide, and you find none. Now you turn back to the headland one last time and survey the ground where the bundles lay, checking for any stray rods that might have fooled you lying half submerged in a puddle, its pale bark almost invisible against the mud, and you pick it up and tuck it into the loose armful of odd rods that you will carry back to the cottage for kindling, and you scan the area once more and see nothing else, only the churned mud of your footprints and the bright striplets in the rays from the fan's droplets that look the fold of this up. The oilcloth is folded in a square at the front of the cart, a heavy piece of canvas that has been soaked in linseed and beeswax until it is nearly waterproof, and you shake it out with a snap of your wrists that sends a fine spray of old raindrops into the air, and then you drape it over the load, starting at the front where the butt ends are, and pulling it back over the top so that it covers the entire stack and hangs down over the sides by a hand's length. The oilcloth is dark brown and stiff with age, and it smells of the linseed and the wax and a faint mustiness from being folded damp many times, and you work your way around the cart, tucking the edges of the cloth under the bottom bundles where you can, pulling the corners tight so that the wind will not catch them, and you use a length of the hempen cord from your coat to tie the cloth down at the four corners, looping the cord from your coat pocket to tie the cloth down at the four corners, looping a tight, bit wide kethsrunik. The cord is rough against your cold fingers, and you work the knots slowly, your hands remembering the motions without any need for your mind to direct them, and when the last knot is tied, you step back and look at the covered load. A dark, anonymous shape now, its contents hidden, a mystery to anyone who might pass on the drove, but not to you, because you know every rod inside. You take one more walk round the cart, checking the wheels again, testing the lashings with a tug, making sure that nothing rattles or shifts, and then you stand for a long moment with your hands resting on the front rail, looking back at the osier bed that has been your world since first light. The cut stools stand in their rows, their bare crowns pale dots in the gathering dusk, and the water between them is black now, reflecting now nothing and fitted without fuss, and the uncut rows on the far side wait patiently for another day, and you know that you will return to them when the light returns, and the thought is not a burden, but a quiet comfort, the knowledge that the work continues and will always continue, that the wait return the light returns, and the year of the bast allows, that the yet carded the croget whittleton the berurgate, and so the fly developed. You turn away from the bed and walk to the headland's edge, where the odd rods and the basket and the linen cloth and the leather bottle are waiting, and you gather them up, tucking the bottle into your pocket, wrapping the cloth around the small bundle of scraps, and lifting the basket by its worn handle, and you carry them to the cart and place them in a small space you left at the very front, behind the front rail, where they will ride safe and not fall out. The basket is empty now except for the folded cloth and the small pot of mutton fat, and it rattles slightly when you set it down, a small hollow sound that is swallowed quickly by the damp air. Now the cart is fully loaded and ready, and you take your place between the two long handles, lifting them from the mide with a heave that starts in your legs and travels up through your back and into your arms, and the cart rises onto its wheels with a familiar groan of wood and a soft squelch as the mud releases its hold on the rims, and you stand there for a moment, feeling the weight of the full load transmitted through the handles to your hands, a weight that is considerable but manageable, and resounds a to carts or the cart creaks again as you shift your weight, and the wheels turn a few inches and then stop, and the whole contraption feels alive in your hands, a willing partner for the journey ahead. You look back one final time over the osier bed, seeing the gathered dusk that has settled into the hollows and the rows, the stools standing in their quiet order, the river a faint grey ribbon, just visible beyond the bank, and you feel a quiet, wordless satisfaction, not pride exactly, but something simpler, the satisfaction of work done well and fully, of a day spent in useful motion, of a load of good withies that will become baskets and hurdles and hands of the village makes. The lapwings have gone to roost, and the moorhens are silent, and the only sound now is the soft, steady hiss of the river, and the creak of the cart's wood as it settles, and the first few drops of the returning rain begin to fall, not heavily, but with a gentle persistence that patters on the oilcloth and on the brim of your hat and on the glossy leaves of the sedge that lines the track. You dip your head once, a small nod to the osier bed, to the day, to the withies that have given themselves to your blade, and then you turn and begin to pull the cart along the headland towards the narrow track that leads to the drove road, the wheels cutting a new pair of ruts in the mud, the load riding steady behind you, and the journey home begins in the grey February dusk, with the rain falling softly and the mist rising from the Rhines and the whole of the Somerset Levels into it ancient, watery sleep. The cart follows the narrow track away from the osier bed, and you walk between the handles with your head lowered slightly against the fine rain that has begun to fall again, the mist rising from the Rhines on either side, so that the world beyond the track's edge disappears into a soft grey blur from which only the nearest sedge blades emerge, each one bowed under a gathering droplet that trembles and falls and renews itself. The wheels make a steady, rhythmic sound on the mud, a soft sucking and releasing that is the voice of the levels themselves, a sound that has accompanied every journey you have ever made along this track, and the cart's axle creaks with a regular note that marks the passage of the yards like a slow clock. The air is colder now than it has been all day, and you feel it on your cheeks and the back of your neck where the scarf has loosened, but the work of pulling the cart keeps your body warm, a deep heat that rises from your legs and your shoulders and spreads outward, and your breath comes in steady plumes that are torn away by the cart's motion and left behind you on the track. The track meets the drove road at the half-submerged alder, and here you pause for a moment, letting the cart's weight settle onto the level ground, while you look back along the narrow way you have come, that there is nothing to see now but the dark line of the sedge and the darker shadow of the osier bed beyond, already swallowed by the dusk. The alder stands beside you in the gloom, its breathing roots pale against the black water, and a single drop falls from a catkin and lands on the oilcloth with a soft tap that is somehow louder than the rain. You turn the cart carefully onto the drove, the wheels bumping over the transition from mud to gravel, and then you are on the raised causeway with the Rhines stretching away on either side, their surfaces just visible as a faint gleam in the last of the light, and the road ahead is a pale ribbon that leads straight towards the village, and the cottage, and the fire that waits. The walk along the drove is slower than it was this morning because the cart is heavy behind you, and your legs are tired from the day's work, but it is a good tiredness, the kind that settles into the muscles without pain, and you find a slower rhythm that matches the creak of the axle and the crunch of the gravel under the wheels, a pace that will carry you home in perhaps an hour if you do not hurry. The rain continues to fall, a fine, steady drizzle that beads on the oilcloth and runs off in tiny rivulets, and the mist has closed in so that you can see no more than 20 paces ahead, the drove road appearing out of the grey and disappearing into it again as you pass, and the only company you have are the pollard willows that line the road at intervals, their dark shapes looming suddenly and then fading behind you like silent sentinels. A single light appears ahead, a faint yellow glow that wavers and then steadies, and you know it is the candle in the window of the first cottage at the edge of the village, a small beacon that means you are nearly home. The sight of it draws you forward without any quickening of your pace, and as you draw closer, other lights appear, one in a doorway, another in an upper window, the scattered glows of families settling in for the night, and the smell of peat smoke drifts across the road and mingles with the damp air and the clean scent of the rain. A dog barks once from somewhere behind a hedge and then falls silent, and the sound of a door closing carries across the still air with a soft finality. You pass the leaning gate at Dyer's Field, its shape just visible as a darker angle against the dark hedge, and you cross the plank over the narrow Rhine where the water moves with a sound like a slow exhalation, and then you are on the short path that leads to your own cottage, the gravel crunching under your boots and the cart's wheels for the last few yards. The cottage looms up before you, its thatch dark and sodden. Its walls are pale grey in the gloom, and the single window is dark because you left no candle burning. But the door is as you left it, and the threshold stone is wet with rain, and you steer the cart to the side of the cottage where a low shed stands with its door open, a dark mouth that smells of dry earth and old wood and the faint sweetness of hay that is not there. You unload the bundles one by one, reversing the careful stacking of the headland, lifting each bolt with the same steady motion you used to load them, and you carry them into the shed where you stand them upright against the wall, their butt ends on the earthen floor and their tips leaning inward so that air can circulate among them, and begin the slow drying that will make them ready for the basket makers. The shed is dry and sheltered, and the bundles look at home there, a store of provision against the winter, and you count them as you carry them in. The same 13 bundles you tied on the headland, none missing, none damaged by the journey. The odd rods you set in a corner by themselves, and the basket you hang on its hook, and the linen cloth you drape over a beam to dry, and the leather bottle you place by the door where you will fill it again in the morning. The cart you push into the shed last of all, backing it in through the wide door and leaving the handles propped against the wall, so that the bed is level and the wheels are off the ground, and you wipe the mud from the rims with a handful of straw, a small act of care that will make the next journey easier. And then you close the shed door and drop the wooden latch into place, and the day's work is truly finished. You cross the short space between the shed and the cottage door, and the rain has stopped now, the cloud breaking apart overhead to reveal a few faint stars that glitter and vanish as the mist drifts across them. And the air is fresh and cold and clean, and you pause for a moment with your hand on the latch, looking up at the sky that has been hidden all day, and then you open the door and step inside. The cottage is dark and cold, but the embers in the hearth are still alive, a faint orange glow that pulses when you open the door, let in the draught, and you kneel on the rush mat and feed the embers with dry straw and willow twigs, just as you did this morning, blowing gently until the flame catches and spreads, and you add a split log of alder that crackles and pops and sends a shower of sparks at the chimney. The fire grows quickly, and the light fills the small room, flickering on the whitewashed walls and the blackened beam and the simple furniture that has been waiting for you all day, and you pull the stool close to the hearth and sit down with a long, slow exhalation that seems to carry the whole day out of your body. Your coat and smock are wet through on the outside, and you take them off slowly, feeling the weight of the water and the wool, and you hang them on the hook by the fire where they will steam gently through the night and be dry by morning. Your boots you pull off with a grunt, and the hose beneath are damp but warm, and you set the boots by the hearth and stretch your bare feet towards the flames, feeling the heat seep into the bones of your toes, and the ache of the day begin to ease. The broth is in its pot on the shelf, a thick mixture of peas and barley and a small piece of bacon that has been simmering for days and added to as needed, and you ladle some into a bowl and set it on the trivet to warm, the smell of it rising and filling the room with a savory richness that makes your stomach remember its hunger. You eat the broth slowly, spooning it out with a wooden ladle, and each mouthful is hot and good and filling, and you soak the last of the morning's bread in the bottom of the bowl and eat that too, and then you sit for a long while with the empty bowl in your lap, watching the flames dance and shift on the logs, and your mind is as still as the water in the Rhines, as empty of thought as the osier bed is empty of leaves in February, and the only sounds of the crackle of the fire and the soft settling of the cottage or ground of the into the back without. When the fire has burned down to a bed of glowing coals and your eyes have grown so heavy you can barely keep them open, you rise from the stool and cross to the bed, pulling back the covers that have been waiting since the morning, and you lie down with your body sinking into the straw mattress that seems softer tonight than it ever has before. The blanket is thick and warm, and you pull it up to your chin and lie on your back with your hands folded on your chest, and you listen to the last sounds of the day, the tick of the cooling iron in the hearth, the scratch of a mouse behind the wall, the soft sigh of the wind as it passes over the thatch and moves on towards the river. The rain returns as you are drifting off, a gentle patter on the thatch that is the same sound you woke to in the dark of the morning, and it seems now like a voice that has been speaking all day in a language you understand without words, a quiet, steady reassurance that the world continues, that the Withies will grow again, that the levels will flood and drain and flood again, that the work will be there when you wake, and that the sleep you are falling into is the same sleep the land itself takes each night, deep and dark and full. Your breathing slows and your hands relax, and the last thing you are aware of before the sleep takes you completely is the sound of the rain on the thatch and the smell of the peat smoke and the deep quiet peace of a day lived fully from dark to dark, and then there is nothing but the long, dreamless rest that carries you through the night towards another February morning, another wet road, another osier bed waiting in the mist.